What would you do if you spent decades building a life in a community, only for it to be ripped away by prejudice and corruption? Imagine being an elderly black woman, sitting peacefully on your porch, only to find yourself harassed by police who, without cause, invade the space you've called home for years. And just when it seems like the weight of the world will crush you, what if your son, a man of unwavering strength and determination, shows up and turns the entire situation upside down? But what secret does he hold that will leave everyone speechless? And could it be the key to bringing justice to a neighborhood under attack? Before we dive deep into today's story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching or listening from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. It was a quiet summer afternoon in a small neighborhood just outside Birmingham, Alabama. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow street lined with aging houses. Among them was the home of 76-year-old Evelyn Carter. It wasn't the largest or the most modern, but it had something that the others didn't. Life. The paint was peeling, the porch worn with years of use. But the garden was a testament to Evelyn's care and love. Flowers in every hue bloomed with vibrant pride, a reflection of the life she had nurtured in that place for over 50 years. Evelyn, with her silver hair and deep brown skin, sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, as she did nearly every afternoon. A glass of iced tea sat beside her on a small table, untouched as she gazed out at the world around her. The heat of the day pressed down on her, but she didn't mind. Instead, her thoughts drifted to the changes she'd seen over the years. She remembered when every house on her street had been filled with families like hers, hardworking black families who built their lives from the ground up. But that was before. Now new faces had moved in. Many were younger, most were white, and the community she once knew felt more like a memory, replaced by something unfamiliar, distance, discomfort. On this particular afternoon, she watched as one of her newer neighbors walked by. Rebecca. Evelyn had seen her often, always with a little dog, always brisk, always polite but never lingering. Something was different this time. Rebecca's pace quickened as she cast a glance over her shoulder, anxiety flickering in her eyes. Evelyn felt a familiar heaviness in her chest. Was it discomfort she saw in the woman's eyes? She had seen it before, but after 76 years, she had long stopped trying to understand why. She had faced too many battles to let this one weigh her down. But then, the wail of sirens shattered the stillness of the afternoon. Evelyn's head snapped up as two police cars screeched down the street, their lights flashing. Her heart leaped into her throat. What was happening? Her grip tightened on the arms of the rocking chair. The sirens stopped. The officers emerged from their vehicles, moving with the precision of people on a mission. Rebecca had hurried down her front steps, now gesturing frantically, pointing in Evelyn's direction. A chill ran through Evelyn, the air around her suddenly thick with tension. She couldn't hear their words, but she could feel the suspicion, the fear radiating from the officers. It was all too familiar. It wasn't long before the officers started walking toward her, slow, deliberate, like hunters closing in on prey. Evelyn's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. She had done nothing wrong. This was her home, her porch, her life. No one would take that away from her. The lead officer, a tall man with close-cropped hair, stepped up onto the porch, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "we've had a report of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. A resident said they saw someone matching your description looking into windows." Evelyn blinked, stunned. She had been sitting on her porch all afternoon. "I've been right here," she replied calmly, though inside, her frustration began to swell. "I haven't moved from this spot." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Do you have any proof of that, ma'am? Can anyone else vouch for you?" Proof? Did she need proof just to sit on her own porch? A surge of frustration boiled up inside her, but she kept her composure. "This is my home," she said, her voice firm, despite the rising tension. "I've lived here for 50 years. I don't need proof to sit in my own front yard." The officer stiffened. "We're going to need you to come with us and answer a few questions down at the station," he said, stepping closer, clearly preparing for her to resist. Evelyn's heart pounded. She had done nothing wrong. How could this be happening? But she knew better than to argue. She had seen much worse in her lifetime, and understood how dangerous it could be to push back. Still, she wasn't ready to give in. She wasn't young anymore, but she had never backed down when it truly mattered. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "Not when I've done nothing wrong." Just as things seemed on the verge of escalating, a black SUV pulled up in front of her house. Out stepped her son, Aaron Carter. At 47, he was a man of authority, a respected attorney with a reputation for calm yet fierce courtroom presence. Evelyn hadn't expected him, but seeing him now was like finding a lifeline in a storm. "Aaron," Evelyn called, her voice steadying as he approached. His sharp eyes took in the scene in an instant. He understood. Without hesitation, he stepped between his mother and the officers. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. The lead officer straightened. "Sir, we're investigating a report of suspicious activity." Aaron raised a hand, stopping him. "I don't think there's anything suspicious about a woman sitting on her own porch," he said firmly. "Unless you have something more than vague accusations, I suggest you step back." The tension in the air thickened, suffocating. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Aaron's presence alone had shifted the dynamic. He wasn't just any man. He was Evelyn's son, a man they knew could challenge them. "We're just doing our job, sir," the lead officer muttered, his tone now uncertain. "We'll check back if we have more questions." Without another word, the officers retreated to their cars, leaving Evelyn and Aaron standing on the porch. Evelyn's hands still trembled, though she tried to hide it. "They'll be back," she said softly, a hint of weariness in her voice. "This isn't over." Aaron placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know, Mom," he said softly, "but neither are we." The evening sun bathed the neighborhood in a warm, golden glow as Aaron helped his mother back inside. Once they were inside, Evelyn sank into her old leather armchair, letting out a long sigh. Her son's eyes met hers. He was angry, frustrated, but also fiercely protective. "They can't keep doing this," Aaron muttered, his voice tight. "I don't care what story that woman told them. They had no right." Evelyn shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "This isn't new, Aaron. I've seen this kind of thing before, just in a different form." She paused, gazing out the window at the fading light. "They might not have fire hoses or dogs anymore, but the fear is still the same. The way they look at us. It hasn't changed as much as people like to think." Aaron's jaw clenched, frustration bubbling inside him. "I know, Mom. This feels personal. It's like they're trying to push you out. You've lived here longer than most of the people on this street." Evelyn nodded, her fingers tracing the fabric of the armchair. "This neighborhood has changed. The new families, they see me as a stranger in my own home. They don't understand that this place was built on the backs of families like ours." Aaron knew she was right. The neighborhood had gentrified, and with it, the sense of community had all but vanished. The homes had been renovated, property values soared, and people like Rebecca, with her nervous glances and tight smiles, had taken over. To them, Evelyn wasn't a neighbor. She was an inconvenience, something to be tolerated or worse, removed. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "I don't care what they think of me, or how many police officers they send to my door. This is my home, and I'll stay right here until I'm good and ready to leave." Aaron looked at his mother, admiration swelling in his chest. She had always been strong, facing life's challenges with a quiet dignity he could only hope to emulate. But this was different. This wasn't just about staying strong. This was about fighting back. "You don't have to fight this alone," Aaron said softly. "I'll be here every step of the way." Evelyn smiled, her eyes softening. "I know you will, Aaron. But this is bigger than just us. It's about how we as a people are seen and treated in this world. It's bigger than one afternoon on a porch." Aaron nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The confrontation was just one incident, but it was part of something much larger, something that had been festering for generations. The phone rang, interrupting the silence. Evelyn looked at it with mild surprise. They rarely received calls at this hour, and after the events of the day, the sound felt jarring. Aaron answered it, his voice cautious. "Hello, Mr. Carter," came the voice on the other end, low and urgent. "This is Officer Jackson. I'm calling regarding the incident that took place earlier today involving your mother. I think we need to talk. Aaron's brow furrowed in confusion. He had expected more hostility, not a call with a tone that suggested something serious. I'm listening. There was a pause, and then Jackson's voice dropped to a hush. I can't talk too much over the phone, but there's something you need to know. This isn't the first time something like this has happened in your mother's neighborhood. I'm not saying it's right, but there's a pattern. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. A pattern? He had known something felt off, but to hear it confirmed was unsettling. What do you mean by a pattern? Aaron asked, his voice now lowering. I can't say much more right now, Jackson replied, his voice urgent. But if you want to know more, meet me tomorrow morning at Southside Diner. 7 a.m. Don't be late. The line went dead before Aaron could ask any more questions. He stared at the phone, the dial tone humming in his ear, a pit forming in his stomach. What was that about? Evelyn asked, her voice soft but concerned. It was one of the officers from earlier, Aaron replied, setting the phone down. He says there's more to what happened today than we know. Evelyn frowned. More? Aaron nodded. He wants to meet tomorrow. Something about the pattern in the neighborhood set Evelyn's heart racing. Her eyes darkened, narrowing with suspicion as her lips pressed tightly together into a thin, unforgiving line. She had lived long enough to recognize that patterns like this were rarely harmless, especially in a community like hers, where people of color often found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. She had seen it before. Whispers behind closed doors, subtle accusations, and before long things would change. People like her, people who had lived in the neighborhood for generations, would disappear, pushed out one way or another. It was always the same, wasn't it? You're going to meet him? She asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet dread. Though she already knew the answer, the question still felt important. Aaron nodded, his expression firm, determined. I need to find out what's going on. If this is happening to other people too, we can't just sit back and let it continue. Evelyn's heart sank, a wave of both pride and fear flooding her chest. She knew he was right. Something was happening, something dark and insidious. If they didn't fight it now, it would only get worse. And yet, she couldn't shake the fear of what might happen next. Be careful, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The weight of the warning hung in the air between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Aaron gave her a reassuring smile, though the storm inside him was evident. I will, Mom. I promise. That night, sleep eluded Evelyn. She lay awake in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Memories of past struggles, of battles fought and lost, flooded her mind. She thought of Aaron, her only child, and how hard he had worked to rise above the challenges they had faced. Now here they were again, standing on the edge of something familiar yet terrifying. She couldn't quite define it, but the feeling gnawed at her, sharp and undeniable. The next morning, Aaron was up before the sun. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind as he slipped quietly out of the house, not wanting to disturb his mother. He drove toward Southside Diner, the streets eerily empty in the early light, the city slowly coming to life around him. His thoughts raced. What could Officer Jackson have meant by a pattern? Why had he been so secretive about it? When Aaron arrived at the diner, the sky was just beginning to lighten, casting a soft glow over the parking lot. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the low hum of conversation from a few early risers sipping their coffee. In the back booth, he spotted Officer Jackson, a cup of coffee in front of him, his face shadowed with fatigue. Aaron approached cautiously, sliding into the booth across from him. Jackson didn't look up at first, staring into his cup, as if the weight of what he had to say was too much to bear. You came, Jackson finally muttered, his voice low, almost resigned. Yeah, I came, Aaron replied, his tone weary but resolute. You said you had something to tell me, so talk. Jackson looked up, his eyes scanning the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even further. There's been a string of incidents like the one with your mother, calls to the police about suspicious activity, each one targeting Black residents. Aaron's blood ran cold. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a surge of anger through him. Why hasn't anyone said anything about this? He asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Jackson shook his head, his face grim. People are scared. Most of them don't want to stir up trouble. And those who do, well, let's just say they've been silenced. Silenced? What do you mean? Aaron's frown deepened. Jackson leaned back in his seat, his face drawn with fatigue. People who tried to fight back found themselves facing trumped-up charges, fines. Hell, even threats. It's not just a couple of incidents. It's organized. Someone wants your mother, and people like her out of that neighborhood. Aaron's mind raced, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. This wasn't just one isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, more calculated plan. And whoever was behind it was willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted. Who's behind this? Aaron demanded, his voice hardening. Jackson hesitated, glancing around the diner again before answering, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know all the details, but it goes high up: developers, city officials, people with money and power. They want to remake the neighborhood. And they see people like your mother as a roadblock. Aaron's fists clenched under the table, rage boiling inside him. And what about you? Why are you telling me this? Jackson's expression softened slightly, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Because it's wrong. I became a cop to serve and protect, not to push people out of their homes. I've seen what's happening, and I can't stay silent anymore. Aaron studied him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his eyes. Something in Jackson's weary gaze told him the man was telling the truth, but that wasn't enough to calm the storm brewing inside him. Aaron, why should I trust you? He asked, his voice icy. Jackson sighed. You don't have to. But if you want to stop this, you're going to need help. And I'm the only one willing to give it to you. Aaron weighed his options. He didn't like the idea of trusting a cop, especially one who had been part of the system threatening his mother. But Jackson had come to him, and that counted for something. All right, Aaron finally said, his voice steady. What do we do next? Jackson took a deep breath. First we gather proof. And then we fight back. The drive home was a blur of thoughts and emotions for Aaron. What Officer Jackson had revealed was more than just a suspicion. It was the beginning of something far larger and more dangerous than he had imagined. As the car rolled down the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Aaron's eyes scanned the houses, noting the glaring differences between the newer, gleaming homes and the older ones, like his mother's. The stark contrast was a reminder of who was welcome and who wasn't. When Aaron arrived at his mother's house, she was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand. The worry in her eyes was impossible to miss. Morning, Aaron, she said softly, but the unspoken question in her gaze was clear. You're back early. What did that officer say? Aaron sighed, running a hand over his face before sitting down across from her. He said it's bigger than we thought, Mom. It's not just about you. There have been other incidents, people getting harassed, threatened, even arrested on bogus charges. It's all part of a plan to push out longtime residents. Evelyn's face remained calm, but Aaron could see the tension behind her eyes. I figured something like that was going on, she said, her voice steady. You can feel it, the way the new folks look at you, the way they talk. They don't say it outright, but you can tell they don't want us here. Aaron nodded, his jaw clenched tight. Officer Jackson says it's organized. Developers, people in power. This is a land grab, and they're using the police to do their dirty work. Evelyn stirred her coffee, lost in thought for a moment. So what are we going to do about it? She asked, her gaze meeting Aaron's with quiet determination. Aaron met her gaze, his own heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. I don't know yet, but Jackson says he's willing to help us gather proof. He's seen things, and he's willing to speak up. We'll need more than that, though. If we're going to fight this, we'll need a legal case. Something solid. Evelyn nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. I've been through enough to know that justice isn't always easy to come by. But I'm not going anywhere without a fight. This is our home. I raised you here. Your father and I worked for years to build this life. And I'm not going to let anyone take it from us. Aaron reached across the table, taking his mother's hand in his. We're not alone in this, Mom. If Jackson's right, there are others in the neighborhood going through the same thing. We can get them involved too. Make this bigger than just one case. It'll be harder for them to ignore us if we stand together. Evelyn smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. It's always been like this, hasn't it? We've always had to fight for our place. But you're right. We're stronger when we stand together. A swell of pride filled Aaron's chest. His mother had been through more than most people could ever imagine, and yet, she remained unshaken. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next few days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Aaron and Evelyn reached out to their neighbors, those who had lived in the community for decades, like Evelyn, and those who had experienced similar harassment from the police. The more they spoke to people, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Nearly everyone had a story to tell. There was Mr. Harris, who had lived down the street for 40 years, fined multiple times for minor code violations, things that new residents never seemed to get ticketed for. Then there was Mrs. Johnson, who had been stopped by the police twice while walking to the grocery store, accused of loitering in her own neighborhood. The stories kept coming, and the pattern became undeniable. The anger in the community was growing, and Aaron knew they needed to act quickly. The longer they waited, the more ground they would lose. Each day, Aaron met with residents, gathering testimonies and researching legal avenues they could pursue. Every evening, he would return to his mother's house, his mind buzzing with new information, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Evelyn, for her part, stayed busy too. She continued her routine, tending to her garden, volunteering at the church, and making sure Aaron didn't carry the burden alone. She was determined to stay strong, even as the threat of losing her home loomed larger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Aaron turned to his mother, his expression serious. "We've got enough now, Mom. Enough to make a case. I've spoken to a civil rights attorney in town. She's willing to take it on." Evelyn looked at her son, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good," she said quietly. "Because it's time. We've been patient long enough." 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. It named the police department, several city officials, and the developers behind the gentrification agenda. The case was built on the stories of the residents, testimonies from people like Mr. Harris, Mrs. Johnson, and of course Evelyn herself. As the days passed, the momentum grew. Local news outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on the quiet neighborhood at the center of a battle for justice. Reporters came to Evelyn's house, their cameras capturing the image of a proud, determined woman standing in front of her home, refusing to be moved. At first, reactions were mixed. Some of the newer residents defended the police, claiming they were simply keeping the neighborhood safe. But as more stories came to light, stories of unwarranted stops, harassment, and fines, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. The case was building steam, but not everyone was happy about it. Evelyn began receiving anonymous letters, threatening messages telling her to drop the lawsuit and leave the neighborhood. One day, she found her garden trampled, the flowers she had lovingly tended to destroyed. Aaron was furious. "This is exactly what they want, to scare us into giving up." He paced the living room, his anger palpable. Evelyn, though shaken, remained calm. "They can destroy my flowers, but they can't destroy me," she said quietly. "This isn't the first time I've faced hate, and it won't be the last." But as the pressure mounted, it became clear that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. One late night, Aaron's phone rang, yanking him out of a restless sleep. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. It was Officer Jackson. "You need to be careful," Jackson's voice warned. "I've heard things. They're not happy about the lawsuit. You and your mother could be in danger." Aaron's heart leaped in his chest. What was going on? "What are you talking about? What kind of danger?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rising panic. Jackson hesitated before answering, the words heavy with urgency. "There are people with a lot of money and power tied up in this. They're not going to let it go without a fight. Just watch your back." Aaron sat up, his pulse quickening. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now it felt like they were dealing with more than just a legal battle. Real threats were emerging. The stakes had just escalated. "Thanks for the warning," Aaron said, his voice tight, trying to keep calm, though his mind was already racing. "But we're not backing down." "I didn't think you would," Jackson sighed from the other end. "Just be careful, Aaron. For your mother's sake." Aaron hung up, his hand still gripping the phone, as if it could anchor him to some semblance of control. His pulse was pounding in his ears. He needed to tell his mother, but how? How could he explain to her that the fight for their home, their community, had now turned into a battle for their safety? The weight of it all was suffocating. He sat there in the dark for a long time, his mind spinning with fear, anger, and the overwhelming need to protect his mother. The future felt uncertain, fragile. The next morning, the kitchen was quiet except for the soft clink of coffee cups. Aaron sat across from Evelyn, the words heavy in his mouth. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant. "We've got more problems." Evelyn looked up from her coffee, her calm gaze meeting his. "Jackson called last night. He says we're being watched by people who don't want this case to go forward." "What kind of people?" she asked, her voice calm but a knowing look in her eyes. "Powerful ones," Aaron replied, his voice tight. "The ones behind the development projects. The ones trying to force people like you out. He says we need to be careful. They could come after us." Evelyn stared at him for a long, intense moment before slowly setting her cup down with a soft clink. "Aaron," she said, her voice unwavering, "I've been fighting people like that my whole life. This isn't the first time someone's tried to scare me out of what's mine. And it won't be the last. But I'm not afraid. I'm not backing down." Aaron admired her strength, but the knot of fear twisted tighter in his stomach. He had seen too many cases like this go sideways, seen too many people underestimate how far others would go to protect their power. "I know, Mom," he said quietly, "but we need to be smart about this. We're dealing with people who don't play by the rules." Evelyn gave him a small, sad smile that spoke of years of hard-earned wisdom. "The rules were never made for people like us," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Days passed and the pressure mounted. The neighborhood, once quiet, was now a battleground, with every resident feeling the heat of the struggle. They fought not just for their homes, but for their dignity, their right to stand strong. The community rallied together, fueled by a shared frustration and an unwavering resolve to push back. But as the case gained momentum, the threats grew more frequent. One morning, Evelyn opened her front door to find a spray-painted message, "Leave or else." It was crude, meant to instill fear. But instead, it sparked something deep within her. "They want us scared. They want us to run." But Evelyn wasn't built to run. "Mom, this is getting dangerous," Aaron said when he saw the vandalism later that day. His face was tight with worry. "They're escalating. We might need to think about protection. Maybe even moving somewhere safe." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Protection from what?" "Cowards with spray cans and threats," she scoffed. "Aaron, I've lived through worse than this. I won't let them scare me out of my home." Aaron ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fear mixing in his chest. "Mom, I know you're strong. I know you've dealt with people like this before. But that was a long time ago. This is different. These people, they're desperate. You heard what Jackson said. They'll do anything to get you out of here." Evelyn reached out and touched his arm, her expression softening. "I'm not leaving, Aaron. This is my home. And I'll stay here until the Lord calls me. If I leave now, what message does that send? That they can bully us into submission? No, I won't do that." Aaron felt torn, between wanting to protect her and admiring her fierce courage. "All right," he said, his voice heavy. "But we're taking precautions. I'll stay here with you from now on. We'll get cameras, alarms, whatever it takes to keep you safe. But if things get worse, you have to promise me we'll reevaluate." Evelyn gave a small nod. "If it makes you feel better, then fine. But I'm not making any promises to run." The days leading up to the trial felt like a constant test of endurance. Not just for Aaron and Evelyn, but for everyone involved in the lawsuit. As the community organized protests, Evelyn, despite her age, stood at the front of every one, her head held high. Her quiet strength became a rallying point for the movement. She gave interviews to the press, telling her story in her own words, refusing to be silenced. One afternoon, during a particularly heated protest, things took a turn. The crowd, gathered outside City Hall, clashed with a group of counter-demonstrators who believed that gentrification was a sign of progress, not oppression. Words were exchanged, insults hurled, and before long shoving began. The police, standing on the sidelines, seemed hesitant to intervene. Evelyn watched the chaos unfold, her heart pounding. She had seen this kind of thing before. She knew how quickly peaceful protests could turn violent. But this time she stepped forward. "Stop." Her voice rang out, clear and commanding. The crowd hesitated, turning toward her. "This isn't how we win," she continued, moving to the front of the protesters. "We don't fight hate with hate. We don't let them drag us down to their level. We stand together peacefully, and we make our voices heard. That's how we win." Her words had a calming effect. Slowly, the tension in the air began to ease. The counter-demonstrators backed off, and the protesters regrouped, their resolve stronger than ever. That night, as Evelyn sat on her porch with Aaron, she felt a quiet peace despite the mounting threats. She knew they were on the right path. She looked at her son, grown into a man she was endlessly proud of, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "You did good today, Mom," Aaron said, breaking the comfortable silence. Evelyn smiled. "I just said what needed to be said. Sometimes people need to be reminded of what we're really fighting for." Aaron nodded, thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what this all means. It's bigger than just keeping our homes. It's about dignity, about respect." Evelyn's smile deepened. "That's right. And that's why we keep fighting, no matter what they throw at us." As the trial date loomed ever closer, the tension in the neighborhood was unbearable. Each day brought new threats, new attempts to intimidate Evelyn and the other residents involved in the lawsuit. The police presence had increased, but Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that they were more interested in monitoring the residents than protecting them. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, going over final case details, the phone rang. Aaron answered it, expecting a routine update. But the voice on the other end was unexpected. "Aaron Carter," the voice asked. "Yes, this is Aaron," he replied cautiously. "This is Detective Harris with the Birmingham PD. I'm calling to inform you that Officer Jackson has been found dead. It looks like an accident, but, well, we thought you should know, given the circumstances." Aaron's heart sank. "What do you mean, an accident?" The detective hesitated. "He was found in his car, off the side of the road. The brakes failed. We're still investigating, but I just thought you should know, considering he was involved in your case." Aaron hung up, his mind reeling. Jackson had been their ally, the one feeding them information about the corruption. And now he was dead. An accident? Aaron didn't buy it for a second. "Who was that?" Evelyn asked, concern etched on her face. Aaron took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "It was the police. Jackson's dead, Mom. They say it was an accident, but I don't believe them." Evelyn's eyes widened, but she remained calm. "You think they got to him?" "I don't know," Aaron replied, his voice tight with anger. "But it's too convenient. He was helping us and now he's gone." Evelyn sat back, her expression unreadable. "So what do we do now?" Aaron clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We keep going. We're too far into this to back down now. But we have to be careful. If they're willing to go this far, there's no telling what they'll do next." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then we watch each other's backs. And we finish what we started." The trial began, the courtroom packed with spectators, reporters, and community members. Aaron sat beside the attorney, his eyes constantly scanning the room, his nerves on edge. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. But the stakes had never been higher. Evelyn sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm and composed. She had lived through worse than this, and she would not be intimidated now. She was here not just for herself, but for every person who had been wronged, for every family pushed out of their homes. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, using testimonies from the residents, the evidence of police harassment, and the shady dealings between city officials and developers. It painted a damning picture. As the days passed, it became clear the defendants were scrambling to defend themselves. But it wasn't over yet. The defense was ruthless, trying to paint the residents as troublemakers, accusing them of resisting progress. Every small infraction, every moment of doubt, had chipped away at their resolve. It seemed as though there was an unspoken effort to undermine the credibility of people like Evelyn, people who had fought for their community for decades. And now, on the final day of the trial, she was called to the stand. Evelyn rose from her seat with slow, deliberate movements, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But she carried herself with purpose. She knew this moment had been coming for months, and with the eyes of the entire city upon her, she was ready. Mrs. Carter, the defense attorney, stood up, his tone sharp as he began. You've lived in your home for over 50 years, correct? That's right, Evelyn replied calmly, her voice steady as a rock. And in that time, you've seen the neighborhood change, haven't you? The attorney pressed, leaning in slightly. Yes, I have. A slight pause. Then, the attorney leaned in a little closer, his next words carefully measured. Wouldn't you agree that some of these changes have been for the better? After all, property values have risen, crime rates have gone down. Evelyn met his gaze unwavering. Maybe for some people, those changes have been good, she said. But not for us. Not for the people who built this community. The attorney frowned, clearly trying to regain control. He pushed forward. But isn't it true that the police were simply responding to calls from concerned neighbors? Isn't it possible that they were just doing their job, trying to keep the neighborhood safe? Evelyn's eyes flickered with quiet fire. Safe for who? She asked, her voice steady, yet laced with an undercurrent of fierce defiance. Because it sure didn't feel safe when they were standing on my porch, accusing me of crimes I didn't commit. It didn't feel safe when they harassed my neighbors for walking down the street. The only people they were protecting were the ones who wanted us gone. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Evelyn remained composed. The attorney seemed to sense he was losing ground, but he pressed on, his voice taking on a sharper edge. So, you believe the police were deliberately targeting you and your neighbors? Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression unwavering. I don't just believe it, I know it. And I know why they wanted us out. They wanted this neighborhood for themselves. For the developers. For the people with money. But we fought back. And we'll keep fighting until we get the justice we deserve. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence after her words. Her quiet strength and conviction filled the room, standing tall and unmoving in the face of scrutiny, leaving no room for doubt. Even the defense attorney seemed momentarily stunned, fumbling for his next words. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Mrs. Carter, he said with a firm but respectful tone. Please continue. Evelyn took a deep breath and met the judge's eyes. What's at the heart of this, she began, is respect. Or rather, the lack of it. They don't respect us, not me, not my neighbors. They see us as obstacles, as inconveniences in their plans to build something shiny and new. But we're not just obstacles. We're people. We've lived here for decades, raised our families here, worked hard to make this community what it is. And now they're trying to erase us, to push us out like we were never here. Her voice remained calm, but it carried the weight of generations of struggle. But we were here. We are here. And we're not leaving. Not because they want us gone. Not because they've decided we don't belong. This is our home. The defense attorney, clearly struggling to regain control, forced a smile. Mrs. Carter, no one is saying you don't belong, he countered, but his words faltered. But isn't it possible that some of these concerns, these calls to the police, were genuine? That perhaps some of the newer residents were simply unfamiliar with their surroundings? Evelyn's lips thinned into a tight smile, her gaze unwavering. Unfamiliar? That's what they call it. Let me tell you something. There's a difference between being unfamiliar and being afraid. And what they felt wasn't just unfamiliarity, it was fear. Fear of us. Fear of people who don't look like them, who don't live like them. But that fear doesn't give them the right to call the police on their neighbors, or to use that fear as an excuse to push us out. The defense attorney opened his mouth to speak, but the judge interrupted him with a firm but kind voice. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. You may step down. Evelyn stood and walked back to her seat, her head held high. Aaron watched her, pride swelling inside him. His mother had always been his rock, but today she was something more. She was a symbol of everything they were fighting for. The trial dragged on for another week, with each side presenting their case. The media coverage grew more intense, reporters swarming outside the courthouse daily. The residents who had joined the lawsuit stood together, a united front against the forces trying to dismantle their community. Aaron spent his days in the courtroom, his nights consumed with legal strategies, the pressure mounting with each passing hour. But he refused to let it break him. He couldn't. Not when so much was at stake. Then finally the day came. The courtroom was packed. The judge took his seat, his expression serious. Evelyn sat beside Aaron, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to calm him, to remind him that whatever happened, they had done everything they could. The judge cleared his throat, his voice measured. This case has been difficult, he began, his tone steady. It touches on issues that go beyond just property rights or police conduct. It speaks to deeper questions of fairness, equality, and how we treat one another in our communities. Aaron felt his heart pounding in his chest, the room spinning slightly as the judge continued. I have reviewed the evidence thoroughly, and while there are no easy answers, there is one thing that is clear. The residents of this neighborhood have been unfairly targeted and harassed. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but the judge raised his hand for silence. The police have a duty to protect all citizens, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status. In this case, it is evident that duty was not upheld. The developers and city officials involved acted in bad faith, using the police to further their own agenda. Aaron's heart was racing. Could it be? Were they about to win? The judge's words hit like a thunderclap. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. The actions taken against them were unlawful, and those responsible will be held accountable. In addition, I am ordering an investigation into the police department's conduct and the role certain city officials played in these events. The courtroom erupted into noise. Some cheered, others shouted in outrage. Aaron sat in stunned silence for a moment, letting the judge's words sink in. They had won. They had actually won. Evelyn placed a steady hand on his arm, her touch warm. We did it, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Aaron turned to her, a smile breaking across his face. Yeah, Mom. We did. The victory was bittersweet. While the lawsuit had exposed the corruption and injustice that had plagued the neighborhood, it also revealed the deep divides within the community. Some of the newer residents were resentful, hostile even, while others were indifferent, more focused on their property values than the lives of their neighbors. But for Evelyn and the other longtime residents, the ruling was a turning point. It wasn't just about keeping their homes, it was about reclaiming their dignity. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The police department underwent an overhaul, with several officers suspended or fired for their role in the harassment. The city officials named in the lawsuit were forced to resign. The developers backed off their plans for further gentrification. Evelyn's house, once a target for vandals, became a symbol of resilience. People came from across the city to meet her, to hear her story, to thank her for standing up when so many others had been afraid to. She never sought the spotlight, but she accepted the responsibility that came with it. Aaron, too, found himself in a new role. The community saw him as a leader, a fighter. His career as an attorney had always made him proud. But this was different. This was personal. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and phone calls, Aaron sat with his mother on the porch. Just as they had so many times before, they watched the sunset together, the air calm, peaceful, as though the world had finally taken a breath after the storm. You did good, Aaron, Evelyn said softly, pride in her voice. Your father would have been so proud of you. Aaron smiled, looking out at the street where he had grown up. We both did good, Mom. And it's not over yet, Evelyn added, nodding slowly. But for now they rested. The weight of the past months began to lift. For the first time in a long time, Aaron felt a sense of peace. The battle had been hard, and the scars would remain. But they had won. They had stood up to injustice and refused to back down. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Evelyn looked over at her son and smiled. You know, Aaron, she said quietly, we've been through a lot. But we're still here. And that means something. Aaron nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude for everything his mother had taught him. Yeah, Mom, he said softly. It means everything. The neighborhood hadn't changed overnight. There were still tensions, still divisions. But there was something new, something hopeful. The people who had fought for their homes, who had stood together in the face of adversity, knew they could make a difference. They had done it once, and they could do it again. Evelyn continued to be a pillar of strength, not just for her family, but for the entire community. People came to her for advice, for comfort, for guidance, and she gave it freely. Aaron, too, found himself taking on a new role as an advocate for others facing similar struggles. He became a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, using his legal skills to fight for justice. But through it all, they never forgot where it had started. On that quiet porch, in that simple house, in a neighborhood that was theirs. They had faced down fear, prejudice, and greed, and they had won. And in doing so, they had proven something that went far beyond property lines or legal victories. They had proven that no matter how hard the fight, no matter how powerful the forces against them, they would always stand together. Because that was what it meant to be a community. That was what it meant to be family. As the stars twinkled in the darkening sky, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing as a gentle breeze whispered through the trees. "It's been a long road, Aaron," she said softly, almost a sigh. Aaron nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "It has, Mom. But we made it." And in that moment, under the quiet Alabama sky, they knew they had.